Drowning is a process that unfolds in several distinct stages. The initial struggle, the effort to hold one's breath, the involuntary inhalation of water, the loss of consciousness, cardiac arrest, and eventually, death. Remarkably, it can take as little as 2 minutes from the moment of submersion for a person to lose consciousness. This detailed account brings to light the harrowing events of the Mossdale caving disaster, a tragedy that struck in June 1967. A team of 10 intrepid explorers embarked on a journey into the depths of the Mossdale Caves. Their mission was not only to explore but also to assist in clearing some of the deeper, less explored sections for future mapping endeavors. These particular sections of the cave were not extensively documented, a common scenario in the world of caving. Despite this, the group's 2 leaders were brimming with confidence in their ability to navigate through the unknown. The group was led by 26-year-old Dave Adamson, accompanied by his fellow caver and friend, Jeff Borrow. Both had a history of navigating the Mossdale Caves, having explored its depths on numerous occasions. Unlike typical tourist-friendly caves, the Mossdale system was known for its challenging terrain. It comprised mainly of narrow, demanding crawls and constricted passages, cluttered with rocks and mud, where standing upright was often not an option. After several hours into their expedition, 4 members of the group, 2 men and 2 women, decided to return to the surface as initially planned. Among these was Dave Adamson's fiancée, Morag Forbes, who was eagerly looking forward to their wedding, scheduled in less than a month. These casual cavers exited the cave around 5 p.m. The sky was overcast, but there were no immediate signs of impending danger. Meanwhile, Dave, Jeff, and the remaining 4 caving enthusiasts, equipped with the necessary gear, ventured further into the underground labyrinth. This group included seasoned cavers, Colin Vickers, John Ogden, Bill Frakes, and the youngest member, 17-year-old Michael Ryan. Their journey led them to the Far Marathon Passage, a daunting, claustrophobic tunnel that stretched the length of 3 football fields over 900 feet. This passage was characterized by its narrow rock formations and a minor water stream running along its base. The Far Marathon Passage, with dimensions of only 18 inches by 12 inches, necessitated a one-way maneuver due to its restrictive size, barely accommodating an average-sized person. The task of crawling through such a confined space, with severely limited mobility, was nothing short of a formidable challenge. Between the near marathon and far marathon passages, there was a small area, about 5 feet in height, where one could partially stand, offering a brief respite before embarking on the next segment of the journey. As the group neared the end of the far marathon, they came upon an even more constricted section, marking their target area for clearing and mapping. Around this time, Morag Forbes made her way back to the cave's entrance, only to find no trace of the group's return. Although it had begun to rain, the weather did not appear overly threatening at that moment. Deep within the cave, the team observed a slight increase in the stream's flow and the groundwater levels. While these changes might have caught their attention, they did not immediately perceive them as a significant threat. However, as the water levels began to rise more noticeably, the sound of the flowing water and the sensation of the water rising around their feet became impossible to ignore. Realizing that they were a considerable distance from the cave's entrance, the decision was made to abort their exploration for the day. Dave Adamson's intimate knowledge of the cave system instilled a sense of confidence in the group, trusting his judgment to lead them out safely. However, they were blissfully unaware of the massive volume of water that was rapidly approaching their location. Morag, returning to the cave entrance at 9 o'clock, was met with a scene of horror. The entrance was completely submerged under a lake of water, rendering it utterly inaccessible. Overwhelmed by fear and desperation, she embarked on a frantic 3-mile run to seek assistance. Inside the cave, the men were making their way back through the Far Marathon Passage. Faced with the rising water levels, their only viable option was to reach a higher chamber as swiftly as possible. The journey through such a long, narrow space, coupled with the force of the water, likely induced a state of panic. Despite the challenging circumstances, Their extensive caving experience guided them to remain composed and move efficiently through this perilous situation, with the belief that they would eventually reach a safer, higher chamber. Young Michael and the more experienced Jeff were the first to confront the tight entrance of the return path. The passage was so constricted that they had to physically squeeze themselves past the rocks, relying solely on their arm strength to propel themselves forward. Their rubber boots scraped against the sides of the passage, aiding in their movement. In this instance, the water was rushing towards their faces, a stark contrast to it trailing behind them as it had on their way in. Jeff Barrow, well versed in the dynamics of water flow within the Mossdale Caves, was confident that a rapid passage through Far Marathon would lead him and Michael to the relative safety of the larger chamber located above. Meanwhile, the remaining 4 members of the group were preparing to embark on their own journey through the challenging passage. Dave Adamson, confident in his knowledge of the cave's layout and safe spots during flash floods, led the group with a sense of urgency. However, Jeff and Michael soon found themselves struggling against the overwhelming floodwaters in the tight passage. The water level rose first above their hands and then their shoulders. They desperately searched for the highest cracks in the passage to keep their faces above the water as it surged into the tunnel. Michael, likely seeking guidance, would have asked Jeff for advice on what to do next. But as the water continued to rise, it became clear that there was no escape from the rapidly flooding passage. David and the others entered the same cramped tunnel, soon facing the same dire situation as their friends. The water level was too high, and they were forced to seek out small pockets of air to keep their faces above the rising water. However, it was evident that there was no escape from this deadly trap. John Ogden, who was likely the last person in the tunnel, heard the desperate calls of his friends to turn back. He used his hands and feet to slide his body backward, searching for a small crack overhead where he could gasp for air, clinging to the hope that the water would cease rising. In a frantic attempt to survive, he wedged his body into the narrow space, a space too tight for a proper fit. Outside the cave, a massive rescue operation was underway. Despite the cave entrance being blocked by water, there was still hope that the men had found a safe chamber to wait out the flood. Hundreds of volunteers and rescuers worked tirelessly to dam the entrance and pump out the water, aiming to lower the internal water levels to allow for safe passage. By Sunday afternoon, a full day after the men had entered the cave, rescuers were able to reach the Far Marathon passage. They called out, hoping to alert the men that the passage was now clear, and they could descend from their high waiting chamber. However, it wasn't until they saw 2 sets of legs protruding from the ridge of the tunnel that the grim reality of the situation was revealed. These were the bodies of Jeff and Michael, who had attempted to lift their upper bodies into a ridge along the path in a desperate effort to access the last breaths of air. The reality of the situation was a devastating blow to the rescuers, who had held onto a slender thread of hope that the experienced cavers had managed to find salvation in an air pocket. One by one, the bodies of the 5 men were discovered. John Ogden's body was not found until 2 days later. He had wedged himself so aggressively into the overhead crack that it took dozens of passes to locate his contorted remains. All 6 men had drowned in an inescapable flash flood that filled the entire cavern with water. Following this tragedy, the cave was closed and remains the final resting place for the 6 men. In 1970, friends of the cavers entered the sealed system to move the bodies to an upper chamber, now known as the sanctuary. Remember to subscribe to the channel for more intriguing and in-depth explorations like this.